So we're at the bottom of page 171. Is it? Yeah. No, the bottom of 170. We're beginning stage 4 of the 10 states of God.
Stage 4.
Yeah, God as embodied soul. Didapni use kvahish ap kohar tara bana deka. That's by Niaz. And the translation is, he desired to see himself. Hence, he assumed to himself varied aspects involving names and forms. In order to understand how the infinitely unconscious state A of God becomes gradually transmuted into the infinitely conscious state B of God and attains full and infinite consciousness, Meher Baba gave the following analogy. Imagine the infinitely unconscious God state A before the creation came into being as motionless infinite ocean. A puff of wind then stirred the tranquil uniformity of this ocean, and immense waves, countless drops of water, and innumerable bubbles appeared from out of the uniformity of the limitless infinite ocean. The puff of wind that set the ocean into commotion may be compared to the impulse of the infinite original urge to know originating with the infinite original whim of God, surging in God to know himself through his infinite God state too. The stir on the surface of the ocean caused by the infinite urge surcharged every drop of that infinite ocean with the infinite original urge to know itself. Thus, Paramatma, in his infinitely unconscious state A, being urged to know himself, simultaneously bestirs the tranquil poise of every Atma in Paramatma with an urge to know itself. This could only be understood when Paramatma is compared to an infinite ocean and the Atmas to the drops of that infinite ocean. But it must also be well noted that every drop of the ocean, when in the ocean, is ocean itself, until the drops inherit individuality through bubble formations over the surface of the ocean. Every bubble thus formed would then bestow a separate and a particular individuality upon every drop. And this created separateness would exist within the uniform indivisibility of the drops of the infinite ocean, as long as these bubbles creating separateness exist. As soon as the bubbles burst, the drops, which are and were already in the ocean itself, come to realize that they are and were one with the infinite ocean, And they gain this consciousness of their eternal infinity in the infinite ocean only after they first experience separateness and then dispel the bubbles of ignorance that were instrumental in bestowing upon them the experience of their apparent separateness from their inherent indivisibility. Mahu, please.
As long as the infinitely innumerable drops of the ocean do not experience apparent separateness, they fail to realize their own homogeneous and indivisible, eternal, infinite existence as ocean itself. It is only through the experience of apparent separateness that Atmas can consciously realize their indivisible oneness as Paramatma. In order to describe the God state 4 of God as embodied soul, let us think of one infinitely unconscious soul, like Atma, of Paramatma in state A. In the beginning, in a state A, the soul Atma has no consciousness and has no impressions or sanskaras. Therefore, at that stage and in that state, the soul, Atma, has no gross form, gross body, subtle body, nor mental body, because the existence of gross, subtle, and mental impressions or sanskaras only can give existence to gross, subtle, and mental bodies. And only the existence of these bodies can make possible the existence of gross, subtle, and mental worlds. Hence, in the beginning, the soul in God state A, being infinitely unconscious and being impressionless, had no consciousness of gross, subtle, and mental bodies, and was also unconscious of its infinite soul, infinite self, infinite self. The soul naturally then had no experience of the gross, subtle, and mental worlds, and also had no experience of the oversoul or Paramatma. Now, this infinite, impressionless, unconscious, tranquil state of the soul reverberated with the first impulse, which we called the first urge to know itself. Simultaneously, with the reverberations of the first urge to know itself, a most gross first impression emerged, objectifying the soul as the absolutely opposite and most finite counterpart of the absolutely infinite oversoul. More lines. The soul being eternally in the oversoul and one with the oversoul has also the infinite potentialities of the oversoul, though latent in its unconscious state. Thus, the soul is also the processor of infinite power, knowledge, and bliss. Therefore, when the impressionless infinite soul receives the very first impression, this impression could be nothing other than the most gross impression, because the soul itself, which is the processor of infinite knowledge, tries to gain knowledge of its own self, capital self. This very conception on the part of the processor of infinite knowledge is infinitely crude or gross, and this infinitely crude or gross conception of the infinite soul imparted to the impressionless soul the most gross first impression. Simultaneously with the most gross first impression, the infinitely unconscious soul also gained the most finite first consciousness. With the increasing gross impressions, the consciousness evolved and the evolution of gross forms gained momentum. Consequently, the evolution of consciousness, the evolution of gross forms, and the evolution of the experiences of the gross world were all affected as the result of the first urge of God to know himself. Because of this most gross first impression of the first urge, the infinite unconscious soul gained the aspects of experience for the first time. This first experience of the infinite soul was that it, soul Atma, experienced a contrariety, means absolutely opposite by nature, in its identity with the infinite impressionless unconscious state A of Paramatma. This experience of contrariety affected changeableness in the eternal, indivisible stability of the infinite soul, and spontaneously there occurred a sort of eruption, disrupting the indivisible poise and unconscious tranquility of the infinite soul with a recoil or tremendous shock, which impregnated the infinite unconsciousness of the infinitely unconscious soul, which is Atma, with first consciousness of its apparent separateness from the indivisible state of Paramatma. But the soul being infinite, the first consciousness of that it derived from the recoil or shock of the absolutely opposite and most gross first impression of its separateness was naturally and necessarily most finite first consciousness. The first consciousness gained by the soul was obviously most finite in proportion to the experience of absolute opposites of its own original infinite state, as in A, state A, capital A. Consequently, it then means that in the beginning, when the impressionless infinite soul was first impressioned, such first impression was an absolutely most finite gross impression. The first consciousness, it means soul or Atma, derived was most finite. Naturally, at that instant, the unconsciousness of the infinite soul actually experienced a most finite first consciousness of the most gross first impression.
Thanks, Mahu. Ernie, please.
Now, if the soul is conscious of impression, now if the soul is conscious of impressions, sanskaras, then the soul must necessarily experience these impressions. And in order to experience the impressions, the consciousness of the soul must experience them through proper and suitable media. As the impressions are, so are the experiences of the impressions. And likewise, so are the proper media to experience the impressions. That is to say, the impressions give rise to experiences, and to experience the impressions, the use of appropriate media is essential. Therefore, as the infinite, eternal, and formless soul has now gotten the most finite first consciousness of the most gross first impression, most obviously and necessarily, this first consciousness of the soul must utilize the most finite and the most gross first medium to experience the most gross first impression. This first medium, adopted by God in his state 4, God as embodied soul, is a first form which, although it is gross, yet it is so inconceivably, infinitely finite that it cannot even be considered as gross. It is so very infinitely shapeless and substanceless, matterless and formless, that it cannot lead one even to imagine that it is gross. Yet this form is the very first gross form that emerges simultaneously, as if in 3 prongs, as the first 3 of the foremost 7 gaslight forms. If a description of these first 3 gaslight forms could ever be attempted, they could only be described from the standpoint of density. The first having infinitely negligible density, then in the next stage, negligible density, and in the third stage is having the first traces of density. These first 3 forms have no evolution. The next 3 forms may come within the scope of our imagination and may be described as semi-gaseous and semi-material forms. Evolution begins with the 4th gas-like form, and finally, there is a 7th gas-like form of the series of 7 foremost gas-like forms, which is hydrogen, and which may be said to include the electron. It should be noted well that the first 6 gas-like gross forms bear no resemblance to the various gases such as hydrogen, nitrogen, and so forth. They are much, much finer, not subtler, subtler, and there's an asterisk. This is in no way to be connected with any form or object of the subtle world, because these forms are solely of the gross world, than those with which the scientists of the age are well conversant. I'm going to read that sentence again. They are much, much finer, not subtler, than those with which the scientists of the age are well conversant. State 5, God as soul in the state of evolution. God as embodied soul now begins to become conscious and begins to know the creation, the nothingness. Although his knowing of the creation at this stage is infinitely negligible, even this most finite consciousness and this minutest knowing, however, creates more impressions, sanskaras, that cause the drop soul, atma, self, to leave or dissociate from the original first bubble form. Leaving the bubble is equivalent to a dropping off of or dissociating from the first form. Even after the form is dropped, the impressions gathered by the evolving consciousness of the soul do not vanish. These impressions remain associated with the evolved consciousness and cause the evolving consciousness of the soul to associate with another appropriate and superior bubble form. The soul is thus able to know or experience more of the creation through the second form. The angle of vision widens and the consciousness of knowing increases in proportion to the simultaneous evolution of form. With the evolution or growth in gross consciousness, the impressions, sanskaras, also increase and cause the soul to assume or associate with a still more complex gross form in accordance with the impressions retained by the consciousness when the second gross form is abandoned. In this way, the evolution of consciousness progresses for ages, concurrently with the evolution of forms, which help to experience and concurrently exhaust the impressions gathered until after countless changes of forms through more concrete and successive stages of stones, metals, plants, worms, fishes, birds, and animals, the soul takes on the human form. In other words, the cycle of evolution of consciousness of soul continues evolving further and greater consciousness with the evolution of forms of higher and higher types, while experiencing and exhausting the impressions of the dissociated forms of the next lower type. Consequently, the evolution of consciousness of souls apparently tends the souls to identify themselves with and gather varied innumerable impressions of higher and higher gross species of forms, unlimited in number in the gross world. The clean-cut major forms with which the souls associate with every leap of greater and greater consciousness are in accordance with the leaps from stone to metal, from metal to plant, from plant to worm, from worm to fish, from fish to bird, and from bird to animal. And ultimately, the last and seventh leap is from animal to human form. It is
Thanks,
very,
Ern. Thanks, Ern. Marion, please.
Only through this evolution of form.
Sorry, Marion. It's
It's very,
there.
thank you, thank you.
You're welcome.
It is very important to understand that the process of evolution of consciousness concerns the evolution of bubbles or forms only, and not the drops or the souls. The souls remain as indivisible and infinite as the unlimited ocean, Paramatma, from the beginning until the end of evolution of consciousness, which terminates with the completion of evolution of form. Only through this evolution of form does the consciousness of ignorance, or the knowing of creation, increase step by step due to varied impressions. And only in the human form can the individualized soul, Atma, eventually realize the oversoul, or Paramatma. As the soul is infinite, the consciousness of the soul must also become infinite. And because consciousness can become infinite only in human form, the human form is therefore the final stage of evolution of form. The soul has to pass through 8,400,000, 84 lakhs, human forms after it has once commenced to reincarnate in the human form until it has attained God realization. The pre-human forms through which it has to pass before it can incarnate in the human form are innumerable. Then I need more screen. Okay. Strictly speaking, there is only one form, the human form, which is latent in all of the previous forms. The mineral, the plant, and the animal forms actually contain the human form in its latent state. And this is gradually and increasingly manifested until it is at last completely expressed as a human being in a human body. Before the human form becomes completely manifested in a human body, such as a man or a woman, the latent human form makes a series of partial turns. In the crystalline rock state, such as granite, the latent human form is completely upside down and is also so in the plant state as well. As the forms progress or evolve, the axis of the body slowly rotates. Excuse me, let me say that over. As the forms progress or evolve, the axis of the body rotates slowly so that it becomes more and can you move that over as it cut off on my right side? Thank you. More and more horizontal. And when we reach the higher vertebrates, we find the head rising up more and more as the axis of the body approaches the vertical. In men and women, we find the human form completely expressed and completely vertical. The details of this evolution of form are extremely complex. There are, for example, certain species of stone, metal, plant, and animal that have what Meher Baba described as a special seat in evolution. These key species of forms are mostly those that are milestones on the evolutionary road, and they mark the first and the last of a certain general class of species of forms. For example, the first species of bird form to follow the last species of fish form, and the first species of the animal form to follow the last species of the bird form, have a special seat significance in evolution. Meher Baba tells us that this whole theme has been explained down to the last detail in his own book that is still to be handed over to the world. And the asterisk there is, the book referred to should not be confused with this publication. Meher Baba has authored an additional work which might be published later. Just as there is evolution of consciousness and evolution of forms, so also there is evolution of the worlds. The evolved consciousness of the soul, identifying the soul with evolved forms, gets more and more impressioned. And in order to exhaust these impressions, it consistently finds its field of expression. And it experiences these impressions on the earth, which is also evolving concurrently with other worlds in accordance with the progressive evolution of the entire cosmic creation. During the course of evolution of consciousness of the soul, while consciously identifying itself with varied, finite gross forms, was also simultaneously, though unconsciously, identifying itself with its finite subtle form and its finite mental form, which associated with the soul, Atma, in compact, homogeneous, unconscious association throughout the course of evolution of consciousness, right from the first urge. During the whole course of the evolution of consciousness, while the soul frequently and consciously dissociates itself from the finite gross forms, which act as media to experience and exhaust the impressions, while evolving greater and greater consciousness. The soul never dissociates itself, consciously or unconsciously, from its finite subtle form and its finite mental form. On the contrary, when the soul dissociates its identification with any one medium of finite gross form, it is the unconscious association of the soul with its subtle form that fortifies the soul. Then, without any gross medium, with finite energy, the driving force, to tend the consciousness of the soul towards identifying itself with yet another form. That is, the next medium of the next finite gross form, to experience the impressions of the last dissociated finite gross form, retained and reflected by the finite mental form of the soul, which is also in unconscious association with the soul.
Thanks, Marian. Mahu, please.
Sorry. It is only natural that together with the evolution of, hold on one second. I'm sorry, I had to. Okay. It is only natural that together with the evolution of greater and greater consciousness of the soul, the evolution of the finite subtle form of the soul also takes place to fortify the soul with greater finite energy to tend the consciousness of the more and more gross conscious soul to identify itself with higher and higher types of finite gross forms evolved by the impressions of the last lower and finite gross form. Similarly, the evolution of the finite mental form of the soul also takes place simultaneously to accommodate, retain, and reflect the increasingly innumerable varied impressions gained and gathered by the evolution of greater and greater consciousness of the soul. Thus, it is that only in a human form are the subtle body and the mental body fully developed. Hence, the soul, associating itself consciously with human form, is, so to speak, fully equipped with gross body, subtle body, and mental body in human form, together with the full consciousness of the gross gained in the human form. Nevertheless, although the soul has gained full consciousness in human form and so experiences the gross world, yet the gross conscious human soul is unconscious of the subtle body and therefore cannot experience the subtle world. The gross conscious human soul is also unconscious of the mental body and therefore cannot experience the mental world. State 6. God as human soul in the state of reincarnation. Should we read the asterisk? There's an asterisk, and we're going to read it. Okay, it's just footnote says, see all also Meher Baba, quote, Reincarnation and Karma in Discourses, pages 301 to 338 by editor. Okay, so I read it again. State 6, God as human soul in the state of reincarnation. The most finite first impression of the first urge gave to the infinite unconsciousness of the unconscious soul the most finite first consciousness. Gradually, varied and innumerable impressions experienced through varied and innumerable gross media gained greater and greater consciousness of the finite gross world for the soul, and eventually the evolution of consciousness was complete when the consciousness of the soul identified itself with the most first human form. Therefore, the soul, having now gained full consciousness in human form, does not need any more or any other higher forms to evolve consciousness. The consciousness gradually gained in the process of evolution is full and complete in human form. Though the soul in this state has gained full and complete consciousness, it is still not conscious of its subtle and mental bodies, nor of its unlimited self, capital self, as one, indivisible, eternal, and infinite. It is only fully conscious of its identity with human form and its varied aspects and experiences of the gross world. Consequently, the soul at this stage only fully grows conscious of the most first human gross form and is still unconscious of the subtle and mental experiences in the gross world, all of the impressions of the most last animal gross form disassociated or dropped by the consciousness of the soul in the latest stage of evolution of consciousness. When all of the impressions of the most last animal gross form are exhausted through incessant experiences by the most first human gross form, then it is but natural that this most first human form is dropped or disassociated from the consciousness of the soul. This experience by the fully conscious soul is universally accepted as the death of the human being. As explained previously, although the consciousness of the soul gets disassociated with the most first human form, yet it can never get disassociated from the unconscious associations of its subtle and mental bodies. The consciousness of the soul retains and experiences the impressions of the dropped or disassociated most first human form through its subtle and mental bodies. In order to exhaust these impressions, the consciousness of the soul must necessarily associate it with a gross form, and therefore it associates itself with the next human form to exhaust and experience the residual impressions of the previous human form dropped. In fact, this next human form is nothing but the consolidated mold of the past impressions retained of the previous body or human form that disassociated from the conscious soul. The association of consciousness of the soul with the next human form is universally accepted as the birth of a human being. In short, in state 6 of God as human soul, in the state of reincarnation, the soul has developed full consciousness in human form, and therefore there is no need for any further evolution of the gross form. The evolution of gross consciousness thus comes to an end with the attainment of the human form, and to experience the impressions or samskaras cultivated in the human and the subhuman forms, the soul has to incarnate again and again into the human form.
Thanks, Mahu. Ern, please.
The kind of human forms with which the consciousness of the soul has to associate is determined by the nature of previous impressions, sanskaras, of virtue or vice, happiness or misery, and so forth. While experiencing the gross world, the soul identifies itself with the gross body, which is destructible, although the soul itself is eternal. In the subhuman stage, the evolutionary process of form and consciousness is involuntary, yet sustained and continuous, with no possibility of slipping down to the lower forms of evolution. In the human stage, which marks the end of the evolution of form and the attainment of full consciousness, the spiritual progress of man through the reincarnation and realization processes is voluntary, and it is also absolutely free from any danger whatsoever of slipping down to a subhuman state, except in flagrant misuse of the powers of the fourth plane. Once full consciousness is gained, it is gained forever and is never lost. And the evolution of consciousness is completed only when the consciousness of the soul associates itself with human form. Therefore, retrograde incarnation is an impossibility once the consciousness of the soul identifies itself with the human form. With the development of full consciousness of the gross world and the human gross body, the soul simultaneously is associated with the fully developed subtle and mental bodies. But as long as consciousness is confined to the gross world, the consciousness of the soul cannot make use of its subtle and mental bodies directly. The soul becomes conscious of these bodies and experiences the corresponding impressions of these bodies through the corresponding spheres of the subtle and mental worlds only when full consciousness, which is conscious only of the gross at this stage, turns inwards toward itself, and the process of the involution of consciousness begins. This becomes possible only when the consciousness of the individualized soul becomes satiated with the incessant experiences of the varied and innumerable impressions of the material or gross life, and only when it has suffered oscillations between the opposites of pain and pleasure for what may seem interminable ages through I lost my spot.
Sorry, I lost it too. Okay.
I just said interminable ages, but I don't see it.
Okay.
There you go.
It's
This becomes
Maybe
possible.
take it from, yeah. Mhm.
Yeah, that's good. This becomes possible only when the consciousness of the individualized soul becomes satiated with the incessant experiences of the varied and innumerable impressions of the material or gross life, and only when it has suffered oscillations between the opposites of pain and pleasure for what may seem interminable ages through the unfailing chain of births and deaths and the process of reincarnation. In the stage of evolution of consciousness, the winding process of impressions, sanskaras, is at work with a view to evolving consciousness, developing higher and higher types of gross forms. In the human stage, the fully evolved consciousness remains, but the grip of impressions, sanskaras, begins to loosen and thin out as a result of continuous jolts experienced by the consciousness of the soul through the seemingly unending chain of births and deaths in the reincarnation process. State 7, God in the state of spiritually advanced souls. After a long drawn out struggle with the life of the gross senses in the gross world, the consciousness of the soul begins to get drawn towards the self of the soul rather than to remain focused on the gross body and its gross environment. After a number of births and deaths, the gross conscious human soul is at last inevitably drawn to embark upon the process which will lead the man ultimately to the goal of God realization in human form. The consciousness of the soul therefore begins to withdraw itself from the world of gross senses and is now ready to undergo the process of involution. The soul is thus said to advance spiritually through the subtle and mental spheres. The subtle sphere, or the subtle world, is the domain of the first three planes of the involving consciousness of the soul. The fourth plane lies between the subtle sphere and the mental sphere, and the mental sphere contains the fifth and sixth planes. This seventh state of God comprises the advance by the pilgrims on the spiritual path through the subtle and mental spheres. The greater the advance, the greater the involution of consciousness. When the soul becomes conscious of the subtle sphere through the subtle body, it identifies itself with the subtle body. And when it is conscious of the mental sphere through the mental body, it identifies itself with the mental body, just as it identified itself with the gross body when it was conscious of the gross sphere through the gross body. The spiritual progress of the soul through these spheres is entirely in imagination. The pilgrim's process in the involution of his consciousness consists in replacing one realm of imagination for a better and higher level of imagination, right from the first through the sixth plane of involving consciousness. In the seventh plane, the involving process is complete. Imagination comes to an end, and reality is realized and is no longer a concept. Those who enter the spiritual path and tread upon it without the help of a master to guide them very often get lost in the labyrinths of sights and illuminations and have little or no chance of redeeming themselves from that position. They are like children who on their way to school get distracted by the sights and attractions of the marketplace. The enchantment on the spiritual path is so great and the enticement so intense that even in the earlier stages of the journey, the pilgrim has a pseudo sense of God realization from which he cannot emerge unless helped by perfect masters. Many an advanced pilgrim in the subtle sphere thinks that he has gained complete freedom from births and deaths, although this is not so. The delusion remains up to the sixth plane of involving consciousness, but it is most conspicuous between the third and fourth planes. The fourth plane of consciousness is the most treacherous in the pilgrim's progress, because this is the stage when all the powers of the infinite energy of the subtle sphere are under his direct command. The misuse of these powers means the downfall and disintegration of the consciousness of the soul. Though it is a fundamental fact that once consciousness is gained, it can never be lost, yet an exception to this rule can occur, but only at the fourth plane, where there is a good possibility of the consciousness gained by the soul being disintegrated. While it is never lost completely, it disintegrates as far back as the consciousness of the stone form. The whole process of evolution of consciousness then has to be repeated to regain the full consciousness and the human form.
Thanks, Ernie. We'll pick up appear on page 183 next time.